Hi, my name is Jamie Angelo, and I did my research project on the effects of health education programs in reducing disease risk factors in women. So, a little outline of my presentation today. First, I'm going to explain some of the research in the area of health education programs. Then I'm going to explain some common reoccurring themes in the research, and then problems I found in this research. Then how those problems led to my research question and what drove the rest of my research, and then how I use a summative evaluation method to evaluate the research that I found on health education interventions. Then I'm going to go over my findings and how those findings are important to the field of public health, and finally end with future directions for this research. So I chose three articles that really sum up a lot of the research of health education interventions. The first article is titled Effects of Educational Interventions on Hungarian Adolescents' Awareness, Beliefs, and Attitudes on the Prevention of Cervical Cancer. The purpose of this research was to both assess the awareness and the attitudes of Hungarian adolescents, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, attitudes towards the prevention of HPV infection and cervical cancer. The researchers used pre and post testing to assess the beliefs and behaviors of the participants before and after a 45-minute long educational program. The educational program followed many different styles, including a physical diagram of what's happening in the body, a biological explanation as to how diseases are communicated through people. The data showed an increase in correct answers to knowledge-based questions, such as what is HPV and what causes cervical cancer. However, there is little research that shows the change in behaviors or intention to take preventative measures, such as reducing the number of sexual partners or remaining abstinent for a longer period of time before first engaging in sex. The second article, titled The Healthy Teen Girls Project, Comparison of Health Education and STD Risk Reduction Intervention in Incarcerated Adolescent Females. The purpose of that study was to determine the effects of an educational intervention on safe sex behaviors in incarcerated girls. The researchers, again, used pre and post testing to assess the beliefs and behaviors of the participants. The participants were divided into two experimental groups who were receiving two different types of interventions. One group was receiving STD risk reduction, and one was receiving a health education intervention. While the health education intervention was seen as more effective at increasing the health knowledge, the SRR, which was the STD risk reduction intervention, was more effective at condom application skills and assertive communication. However, neither intervention, again, showed a change in behavior, such as a reduce in post-release contraction of STIs, and neither led to safer sex practices in terms of abstinence. The third article I chose studies the impact of health education intervention in prevention and early detection of type 2 diabetes in women with gestational diabetes. So that study followed the participants after implementing the educational intervention, which sought 5 outcomes: knowledge, beliefs, self-reported practices, gestational weight, and postpartum weight. The women in the intervention had increased knowledge and beliefs. Additionally, they were more likely to be breastfeeding at 6 weeks postpartum. More women with excessive body weight were maintaining a healthy gestational weight as opposed to the control group. So it's clear that the public health field puts a lot of resources into educating the population, and the setup of these interventions were all very similar, with a pre and post test before and after some kind of intervention that was like a class or a video. And sometimes, if they had the resources, the researchers would follow up with follow up with the participants to see how those beliefs or that education could possibly have led. However, some problems in this research. While trying to research educational interventions, you find every article is about an intervention. However, I was never able to find any research about how effective these interventions are in reducing these risky behaviors or disease risk factors in the populations. While it appears in the previously cited articles that the interventions increase knowledge, it still remains unclear if all in all, they actually led to a change in the behaviors of the participants. It is this apparent gap in research that led me to my research question, which is, are health education interventions effective in reducing disease risk factors in women? I used the summative evaluation method as outlined in Fu, Peterson, Cannon, Shavelson, and Cooper's 2015 paper. They made three main points to summative evaluations, and I used two of those, which are the interventional rationale and methodological rigor and appropriateness. The interventional rationale examines the intervention's audience, methods, and context, while the other basically focuses on the limits of the research and whether the methods match the purpose and the given sample population. So when looking at an article for effectiveness, it was important to first look at the interventional rationale, who the audience was, what the methods were, where the study took place, etc., and then examine the methodological rigor and appropriateness. If the methods didn't make sense for the population, for example, if a written test was given to an illiterate community, that isn't a proper methods for that population. So that was a very important thing to look at, especially in these programs that are being implemented in certain communities that may not be speaking English or may not have a high literacy rate. Next, my findings were ultimately inconclusive. So again, it seems apparent that the knowledge of risk factors is increased in every study. That really can't be denied. People are answering questions accurately after the interventions. But there's a number of problems in the research that keep me from ultimately concluding if the risk factors themselves decreased. First, many well-designed studies simply just didn't have the funding to follow up properly or have just long enough follow-ups to see the results. Second, many studies are self-reported, meaning that there's a certain level of bias that comes with it. If all of the participants are learning about the benefits of condoms and they were told that they should be using condoms and then asked to report on their condom use, it's very possible and happens frequently that people will report using condoms more frequently than they actually do, or whatever the risk factor is, doesn't have to be condoms, because they are thinking that that's what's expected of them. So that can cause a bias. With how much the public health field pushes education, one would think that the education would have a direct and clear tie to healthier people and reduce risk factors. However, this wasn't the case in my research. Implications of this. The research on the gestational diabetes was the only cited article that actually supported that there was a change in behavior, but I would argue that this is due to the short-term nature of pregnancy. Not that pregnancy is easy, but easier to commit to a 6-week or 2 or 3 months of breastfeeding as opposed to a lifetime change in how you're already doing something that you're doing, like implementing an exercise program into your life every day. Otherwise, the rest of the studies, such as the Hungarian adolescents and incarcerated girls, reinforce the fact that the interventions don't change behaviors. Again, there's some bias within these that makes it really unable to definitively say what's happening. These findings are important to the field of public health, where they emphasize the importance of education. Also, it's important to note that I'm not advocating for not educating populations. I just think that there should be more research in this area to see how much the education is actually affecting behaviors. My recommendations for future research. So future research could try implementing educational interventions in populations that aren't already displaying these risky behaviors, such as the Hungarian adolescents. They are implementing a intervention in a population that's already having sex when their intervention is aiming to try to reduce sexual partners or increase the length of abstinence or have the adolescents get the HPV shot, and the HPV shot should be given prior to sexual contact for sexual contact. So maybe if they were implementing that in a population that wasn't already having sex, they may see more changes in behavior as a preventative method as opposed to actually changing what's already occurring. Another future research area would be comparing the various educational models, such as the health belief model or the trans theoretical model. You could compare how effective those are in inflicting changes of behaviors in participants.